My name's James R. Van Buskirk, and I was born in Liberal, Kansas in 1924. And I went to high school there. My dad was the principal, and so we lived there. My parents lived there for years. But that's where I was born, Scenic Center of the Southwest, down there at Liberal. December 7th, 1941, I was in a church choir, and someone came in, a Judge Rendham, and his son was in the Army Air Force, Air Corps back then, and he was in, I believe he was stationed in Pearl Harbor, and he came in and told us about about the Pearl Harbor thing. That was on a Sunday morning. I was 17, I think, and then I turned 18 in June. But anyway, perhaps I was 18, and I graduated from high school in 1942. So the day after I graduated, a friend of mine, Charles Dudley, and I decided, he had talked to me about, I had a couple of friends that had joined the Marine Corps, before they graduated, close friends. So I thought that's what I wanted to do. But he talked me into going to work for Pan American Airways. And when you're a high school senior, and raised in a pretty close environment, we didn't know a lot about a lot of things. A town of about 4,000, that sounded pretty big time. So we went to work for Pan American Airways and went to Miami, Florida. Got on the bus. We went down there, and they trained us to be radio operators. And we went to school a half a day, and then we worked on radio equipment half a day. And that was all right. And then I found out that what they were doing was they were using Pan American uniforms and using Pan American equipment in fields and flying into South America with equipment and whatever to some of those South American countries that were neutral, with the Axis powers, so they could use their facilities and fly Army and stuff from there, from South America, like Belém, over to North Africa. But that's what they were doing. And then I found out the Army Transport Command really was financing all this, and we worked for Pan American Airways, but it was really the Army Transport Command. So I left there after about 5 or 6 months, and I went to join the Marine Corps. But I found out I couldn't get in because I was permanently deferred. I didn't know that. I had a 2B rating. It was a deferment that we got because we were through the Army Transport Command. I didn't know that, or Pan American Airways. Worked for the Army Transport Command, and they paid all the salaries and everything, But it was the way the government could use those airfields and that equipment. Otherwise you couldn't fly Army stuff into those neutral countries. So then I went to Jacksonville, Florida, and worked in a carpenters union for a while with a Hal Jeffcoat, who later on played with the Chicago Cubs. And he and I stayed in a little cupola in a big old southern home that a lady and her black maid ran. So we'd lock the doors at night for her and so forth, so we stayed there pretty reasonable. But then he finally got into the Army. He was a paratrooper, and I finally got into the Marine Corps, and that was in 1943, early 43. I went to boot camp in Parris Island, and lo and behold, I was, of course, after you take all those tests, they put me in communications because I was pretty well accomplished as a radio operator. And after I was in there about 3 or 4 weeks, they came down and they transferred me into radar. And I thought, well, what do I want to do that for? Well, one of the sergeants there in the radio school said, you go ahead to radar. They're passing out rates, better than anyone else. So he said it'd take 6 months or a year to get someone up to your speed, with radio. But I said, okay, so I transferred to radar. Well, lo and behold, we went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. That's where we were. And we went to school in the morning, and in the afternoon, and at night. And we went to school like 10, 12 hours a day on radar. So finally, another friend of mine, Tim Vogt, and I decided we'd get out of that. We wanted to go win World War II, So we went to see the captain, I think it was, and he said, there's 2 ways to get out. You can get into field telephone. That's where you run those little carts and string wire and climb poles, or permanent mess hall. So we went back to school. Then they brought the 13th AA Battalion up from Cuba. It was a defense battalion, or anti-aircraft battalion, they called them. And old Colonel Cutts, that invented the Cutts compensator on the Thompson submachine gun was the colonel. And he was a little short guy, reminded me of the little king, you know, in the funnies. And he had a tall, beautiful wife, and he ran around in a Cadillac. He had all this money because he had patented that Cutts compensator. Anyway, he was the CO, and we left Camp Lejeune, and we went to Pearl Harbor. We got to Pearl Harbor, and they broke the 13th AA up. So, because they didn't have so many islands to defend at that time, I guess. So, from there, I went to Saipan and then Tinian, and we were assigned a radar unit on Tinian up on a little hill there by Hell's Half Acre in Tinian, and we had an old 270 radar, which is like a huge bed springs. Back then they were pretty odd, you know. They weren't as, technically they weren't like anything they have now. But anyway, we had that 270 radar, and it would go out about 150 miles. And then of course we had the IFF on it, so any planes coming in we could pick up, you know, with underneath with the BIP. And we kept that on the air, and we were up there. I was up there maybe 2 or 3 months, and I had that thing going. And then the Japs were all along there, and they were trying to clean them up, but a lot of them were in that sugar cane along there, and we could hear them in there at night, you know, and they'd come and get water out of our Lister bag at night sometimes. But all of them, you know, didn't want to surrender or commit hara-kiri. There were a lot of them scattered around up there. Anyway, I left there, and they gave me 34 service books, and I had 34 guys, and sent us down to Peleliu in the Palau group. That's right across from Angar. And they had some radar gear down there they were having trouble with. So I went down there with these guys, and we had 602 radars, and right immediately north of Peleliu was the island of Babelthorpe, and there were over 100,000 Japs marooned there, you know, would bypassed. So we had those 602 radars out there because those Japanese were literally just starving to death there, you know. They couldn't get anything in. The Navy wouldn't let anything in, you know, to bring them supplies or anything. And at night when the tide would go out, they could actually almost walk across from there over to Peleliu, to the other islands. Sometimes they would get on boats, and these guys were starving. It was terrible. They tried to get out of there, you know. And those little 602 radars would pick up a tin can in the water, and then would flip on the searchlights and the 50 calibers that just, you know, take care of the thing. So that was what we were doing there. Though it was kind of pitiful. They would even try to raise gardens, and they'd get their garden up so high, and there was part of a Marine air wing there, and they'd go out and tear up their garden, you know. So they were just literally starving to death. They were just trying to get by. They'd make a little nest in that sugar cane field, you know, and they'd lie in there and sleep in there at night and chew on that sugar cane, I suppose. One night, there was about a quarter mile from us, there was a Army artillery outfit. And on the side of the hill there in Hell's Half Acre, just hills went like this. They had set up a movie, and they'd get movies once in a while. On the side of the hill, they'd cut a little bank in the side of the hill there, and we'd use some. They had a lot of those wooden crates, you know, and they'd use those for seats. So one night, 3 or 4 of us went over there to see this movie, and they said, "Hey, don't set up in the top 3 rows because we know those Japs are sneaking in at night up there. They're right up against the sugarcane out of that field, you know, and they were in there watching the movie." Said, "And these guys have been bugging us and stealing supplies and so forth." So they said, "Don't stay in the top 3 rows because the movie had been on about 30 minutes, and they just turned on some machine guns and just cleaned up that top 3 rows, you know." And a lot of the guys got aggravated because they broke up all the seats. You know, all those wooden, they were hard to come by, wooden, tore them up. But anyway, they got a few Japs, but not many. But the Japanese at that time on Tinian, those that were left were just trying to get by, you know. They didn't all commit suicide. I was never in a firefight. I wasn't up, you know, in that type of operation. I was in communications and radar, and we were always back. We were always more or less defense battalions, I used to call them. Then they became AA battalions. But as the war moved on, they didn't need us so much. The war was over, I think. It was about over, and we were on board ship, and I thought I was going home on points. We got up to Guam, and they transferred me, a lot of us, to the 6th Marine Division, headquarters battalion. So we ended up in Tsingtao, China, in Shantung Province. The Japanese had everything all boarded up. They'd been there since the 30s, you know. They'd moved in there. And they thought we were going to go in there and kill and rape like they did the Chinese, but they were scared to death of us. Then what the Marines were doing there, primarily, they'd pick up all these Japanese that were there, and there were thousands of them, and march them down to LSTs, delouse them, and send them back to Japan. So we were over there in Tsingtao. We were there about a week, and I was there about a week, and then the Japanese forces that were there, we had a couple thousand out there, and we had a big surrender thing, you know, and they surrendered. And about a week or two after that, one of these Chinese bandit gangs, you know, anybody that was a leader would have a gang, and they would be either nationalists or communists or whatever they wanted to be, and they came up over the hill. They were going to come into Tsingtao and take over, and so they sent out a part of a battalion of artillery and some infantry, and those guys came up over the hill, those crazy, wild Chinese groups, you know. They didn't impress you too much, you know. They were little, they had obsolete firearms and everything. They saw that Marine group out there, and they turned around and they just ran. They ran, you know, back into the interior. What happened was, when we moved in to Tsingtao, they took the last war group, whoever was in charge, you know, in the city, and made them the police force and the mayor and so forth. So you'd have these little Chinese with these old-time 1918 rifles with a bayonet on them. They'd be about this tall, you know, and the rifle was taller than they were. And they were the local police. And then, of course, we had MPs out around all the time, too. But they took over the city, and their CO was the mayor or whatever, you know. And that's the way they ran it. And it was kind of pitiful that the Chinese, you know, were not much of a force. It was pitiful. They were, all of them, half-starved. Most of them had some type of disease. Back then, they claimed that 80 or 90% of them were born, you know, with syphilis in their bloodstream. And so they weren't too impressive as fighting men, you know. But and that was the Chinese, and they'd have different warlords, would have different groups. And the last warlord in the city is the one they left there. But that's pretty much what we found. I was over there in China in about another 4 months, and then arrived back in the States and was discharged on the East Coast. Well, then after the war, I went back to discharge in Carolina, and then I married Gloria, my wife. And in 1946, we got married, and then we moved back. We went back to Wichita, Kansas, and I went to school at Friends University, and then I transferred up to Washburn, and then I went to work. We had 2 children by then, so then I went to work for International Shoe Company, and did that. And then I ended up with a couple other guys. We had a couple stores in Nebraska. And then we moved out here in '56. We lived in Wayne, Nebraska, Omaha, and then Wayne, Bellevue, and then Wayne. Moved out here in '56, and have been in Broomfield ever since. The reason I moved to Broomfield, we had a store in Nebraska, and we were going to move out here and have a safety store company whereby you take these trucks and go around and sell safety equipment, you know, and have a safety shoe store. And so, but they didn't get the shopping center built. I've always liked Colorado. It was west. I liked it better than eastern Nebraska. You know, there's more opportunity out there. It was more frontier, more undeveloped. But now it's all of a sudden it's developed. It's here. I ran the first grocery store in town. It was under Empire Savings, underneath and back there. There was Allen Eber Drug was down there, and Cowboy Cleaners, and Harold Conover's Barbershop, and I had the grocery store. I hired a full-time butcher, and we sold freezers with food in them because there wasn't, you know, Broomfield was kind of isolated back then. There wasn't much. And we used to finance it over at the bank in Louisville. So that's why they talked me into running that first grocery store. Turnpike Land wanted somebody to run it, so I did. Everyone out here was about in their 30s then, you know. It was a young group. And it was fun. It was really pioneering, I guess, in a way. And we watched Broomfield grow. Midway was still just gravel, you know. It wasn't paved. And so we've watched Broomfield grow. It was interesting because the town was new. There wasn't any old-time set group, you know, that controlled everything. Everybody was on their own, equal. You do pretty much what you wanted to do. In the 50s, so many of us, you know, two-thirds of the houses out here were VA no down, you know. The people moved in, and everybody had dogs and kids, and not much money. You didn't have to lock your door. There wasn't anything worth stealing, and that's pretty much the way it was. We didn't have a policeman, so we finally, of course, Boulder County never did give us anything but the back of their hand and a lot of lip. We went up and hired a fellow named Stroh in Lafayette, and he'd come over to Broomfield at night and patrol. And that's the only policeman we had, and we'd go around door to door, JCs and various individuals, and collect money so we could buy a night watchman. Boulder County wouldn't even send a deputy sheriff over here at night, you know, to patrol. So we've always been on our own over here, you know. We were always the red-headed stepchild as far as Boulder County was concerned, including when people would run for office, you know. Broomfield people just can't get elected in Boulder County. If you're from Broomfield and you're a Republican, you might as well forget it. Even if you're from Broomfield and you're a Democrat, you better mostly forget it, because that political thing in Boulder is ferocious. When Broomfield started, we had our own school district number 43. And we built, Bill Reynolds, Wes Junkweiler, Wesley Voth, and some others were on that school board. We built Emerald School and paid for it ourselves. Boulder County didn't pay a penny of it. Then we built Cole School. We built the high school, or junior high and high school. And I think Cole School we built. And then we joined RE2. But when we joined RE2 didn't pick up any of those bonds. Broomfield itself paid off every one of those, every dime. We went into RE2, I think sometime in the 60s. I don't remember just when. Sometime in the mid-60s, I believe. We did away with School District 43 and joined RE2. Our biggest mistake. We had 2 elections. First time we turned it down. The second time, we went into Boulder County RE2 by about 2 or 3 votes. We had 17% of the students, 5% of the money out of Boulder. They had classrooms over there in elementary schools vacant, and we had kids stacked up over here at Cole. Pitiful. So we never, until we built, the best thing I like about that new shopping center, that takes a lot of it away from Boulder and gives it to Broomfield. And they've had it coming. They deserve it. Of course, we're still in RE2, so they ought to be giving us more schools and taking better care of us than they did before. Because if we would go into our own school district, which I hope we do someday, you know, but it's hard to do. Legally, it's hard to do, because then you have to go out and raise enough money to pay everybody for the, like Adams County owns some of these new school facilities, and Jefferson County has some. But so was getting us into a city and county was hard to do, but they accomplished it. So you said we're going to have 5,000 people or something like that, or 5,500 people by a certain date. But, you know, it was pretty stagnant for a long time, and the market was down. And a lot of times I've had guys come to me and say, Jim, I've been transferred. I got a GI loan or FHA loan on my house for $95 a month, PITI. I can't get anyone to take it. Could I deed it to you, you know, to protect my credit? And I picked up 1 or 2 of those, but primarily I didn't. And a lot, they were hard to rent back then. First house I bought in Broomfield was on 270 Midway, VA no down. The payments were $93 a month, PITI. Of course, back then you could get a water and sewer tap for $300. Now a water and sewer tap, I think, is $13,500, more than the house. Now, because they charge so much, everybody wants growth to pay for itself, so they charge the developer so much for the land and the streets and curb and gutter and everything. So you've got lots selling for somewhere around $75,000 to $150,000 a lot. before you ever dig a hole and build a house. So that's where a lot of these increased costs come from. In about 1960, I had my own company, and then I developed with a partner or two, with Bob Levy and I and L.E. Brown, some of us, we developed Broomfield Industrial Park, which is all built out now. We did that. We did a lot on the West Slope, enjoyed the West Slope. We had a mobile home park over in Delta. We had a building, an old office building, because it was converted in Grand Junction. It used to be St. Mary's Hospital. Then we syndicated a ranch up by Meeker. We had 12 partners in it. And then we had a subdivision in Rifle, Palomino Park. So we had a lot of things going, you know, that we enjoyed doing. Probably should have just stayed more or less in Broomfield and up in Weld County, where I did a lot of stuff. But it was all enjoyable. I've had a good life. I've enjoyed real estate. Then, of course, I was in Rotary. We started Rotary in 57 and 58. And I was charter president of Rotary, so I had a lot of friends there. Of course, I was in the JCs. We had a heavy JC program then. Well, it was Bob Fox, and he had Turnpike Lumber Company. And it was out there now where now you have all Ford Garage Building, all that new stuff out there. But it was in that area. And we had our first meeting over there, and we were, I think there were almost 100 people joined. There wasn't any other organizations at that time. And then we started having that Broomfield boom on the, you know, we don't, for that, on the 4th of July or thereabouts, we'd have that big celebration. And we had, that was quite a thing. We enjoyed that. And we had it, brought in a tent, you know, with an oak floor for dancing. And everybody was involved in it. And that's where the Broomfield thing started, from that Broomfield boom back then. I had the grocery store then, and I know the women, we tied up a lot of roasts, and the women would take them home and cook them, bring them back, and we'd slice them in the slicer, and then we'd put them in, they'd put them in gravy, you know, and sell hot roast beef sandwiches and stuff. But everybody knew everyone, and it was just like a new community. It was a lot of fun. We had a lot of energy back then. And then I was appointed a county commissioner in about 1970 or 71. And my wife was a Girl Scout organizer, and she ran that for years. And she was instrumental. She had that first Girl Scout shelter built. She had some builders that donated their labor and built that first Girl Scout shelter down there. And so we've been active. We had raised 5 daughters here. And they all graduated from Broomfield High School. All of them went to either Colorado Women's College or DU, and they all graduated there. 2 at CWC and 3 graduated at DU. Well, of course, to me, the Marine Corps, I always thought a lot of it. That was my college, you know. I was 18-year-old, 19-year-old kid, you know, so I was pretty well impressed. And, you know, at that time, at that age, you weren't afraid of anything, you know. And it was quite a learning experience. One thing, it taught you a lot of discipline and how to get along in the world. I personally think today a lot of these young guys that don't know what they're going to do when they're 18 ought to be in for 2 years, just for the fact to teach them a little discipline and how to take care of themselves and one thing and another that they don't seem to get anymore because the parents are all working all the time. There's no one at home. So a lot of these young guys need a little help along those lines, I think. But that Marine Corps did that for me. That was my college. And that's about my story. That's how I won World War II.